Hello, I'm John Walton, and I am the Professor of Old Testament Emeritus at Wheaton College.
Dr. John Walton, welcome back to Exegetically Speaking.
Always great to be on the show.
I think you have probably been on about as much as anybody, and
may
your
be.
podcasts have done really well over the years since we did this.
I'm glad to hear
in
it.
2018, I think. Something like
Wow.
that. Thousands of people around the world have heard it. Really excited to have you. Today we're talking about Daniel 12, and you and Aubrey Buster are working on a commentary. Give us a little word about that project.
Well, it's in the Erdman's New International Commentary on the Old Testament series. This is going to be 2 volumes. So, and the
I bet
first,
you divided it chapter 6.
Yeah, we did. So, chapters 1 through 6 is already at the publisher. 7 through 12 are supposed to turn in this month. So, it's moving right along.
This has been a great commentary over the years, I think, and I'm glad you and Aubrey are part of that.
Well, we're privileged to be part of it.
All right, so why Daniel 12 today? What are we talking about?
Well, it's one of those passages, Daniel 12, 2 and 3 specifically. It's often cited as the clearest and sometimes cited as the earliest reference to the doctrine of resurrection. Which, of course, is an important doctrine and one that we affirm. It's clearly presented in New Testament.
It's almost taken for granted, right?
But we still have to ask the question, exactly what shape does this take in the Old Testament? And what are these verses in Daniel actually saying?
Well, why don't you read those 2 or 3 verses, and then we'll get those out there, and then we'll dive into it.
Sure. This is from the NIV. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever.
All right, well, what are we to make of that? Is that the doctrine of resurrection?
Well, let's think about it. First of all, by talking about those who sleep in the dust and awaking, there's clear reference being made to Isaiah chapter 26.
Okay.
And
so Daniel's looking back to Isaiah 26,
Right.
which may be the earliest, in fact.
Maybe. Some people think so. Okay. Isaiah 26 could be speaking about individual, could be speaking about kind of the nation of Israel, like dry bones in Ezekiel.
Coming back.
Yeah.
Coming back.
So that's under dispute. But so he's using that language from Isaiah, and of course he's got everlasting life in there. So of course Christians think about then resurrection. But there's some things here that catch our attention right off. Some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. We say, wow, what's this sum? First of all, the fact that you have both righteous and wicked with separate destinies.
Right.
That would certainly be the first indication of that. Isaiah 26 has no such suggestion. So that's what makes this interesting. Looks like separate destinies for the righteous and the wicked. But in both cases, it's some. So interpreters have noticed this and said it doesn't look like a general resurrection here. Furthermore, it doesn't talk about punishment the way we think about it for the wicked. This is talking about shame and everlasting contempt. That's about how you are perceived. Perceived by whom? What does that have to do with? Furthermore, we have the wise, notice not the righteous, but the wise.
Right.
And then they're compared to the brightness of the heavens and the stars. And it talks about leading many to righteousness. What's that all about? So there are these numerous complexities in the verse. It furthermore doesn't talk about, are they being resurrected to life on earth or life in heaven, to be with God, to be in hell, to be what it doesn't say any of those things.
Right.
So that's been the problem with these verses.
So is this just a hint maybe at what is to come?
Well, that's how most have taken it, but it seems to have strangeness in the details. So here's how we approached it. We started with the back, and we said, okay, if this is about, if the wise, and let's just leave that to the side for now, right, are like the stars And like the brightness of heavens, who lead many to righteousness, we have to ask, how do the heavens and the stars lead to righteousness? Right? If the wise are going to be like the heavens and the stars, so ask the question then, how do the heavens or the stars lead to righteousness? And that's what broke it open for us, okay? Because we asked that question. There's always a thing in exegesis.
You always want to ask those kind of questions, right?
Knowing the question to ask. And sometimes you don't see it right away. When we asked that and said, okay, how do this, and here, stars and heavens, we're talking about constellations, not individual stars and not clouds of heavens. We're talking about constellations in that juxtaposition. Okay, so how do constellations lead many to righteousness? And when you ask the question, the answer is almost immediate. The constellations tell stories.
Ah, okay.
They've always told stories. For the for the Assyrians, Babylonians, they told stories. We have them. For the Greeks, they told stories. In the Hellenistic period, the constellations told stories. And they tell stories that are supposed to be pedagogical, moralistic, leading to righteousness. Hearing the stories of the heroes of old, enshrined in the stars, is supposed to lead to righteousness. And not only that, now suddenly the shame and contempt make sense. Because the constellations don't just tell the stories of the heroes, they tell the stories of the villains. And so they're held in shame and contempt.
You see, the stars themselves.
The stars, the constellations, and the stories that cultures associate with them are didactic. So you can see we're backing through the passage to make sense of it. So the stars, teaching in righteousness, contempt, now that backs right back into everlasting life, because that's how people live forever. In stories. People live in stories.
So rather than a personal existence then, beyond death, those who sleep in the dust, those who have died for sure, then this is a existence in the stories that are told about you.
In the Hellenistic period, people are being martyred. The wise, Daniel's group, the wise, the righteous, they're being martyred by the persecutions of Antiochus' fourth Epiphanes. And they talk about the kingdom of God coming, but here are all the righteous people being slaughtered. What hope do they have? He doesn't give them the hope of living forever in eternity or being punished eternally. It's not a resurrection story. It's a story of living eternally in stories. This is the way I paraphrase it, if I can read it briefly.
Absolutely.
We are but lingering shadows that soon fade as they dissipate into the mists of time. Only a few experience resurrection from memory to story. That is, they awake from the dust of faded memory and take on new life as their stories are retold. Like the constellations of the heavens that enshrine stories of the unforgotten, their stories will broadcast their legacy. Some will live on in infamy, villainized through stories that subject them to repeated scorn and reproach in endless cycle. But others will be immortalized in stories that will echo through time and eternity, inspiring generation after generation to have hope in the undaunted pursuit of righteousness and wisdom.
So you've already written chapter 12. That sounds like you wonder. Great prose. Yeah. Great prose. That's a very interesting approach. I've not heard it put that way before.
It's nowhere.
It's nowhere.
We thought we asked the question.
Yeah.
That hadn't been asked.
Yeah.
And once you asked the question, the answer became rather obvious.
Back into it the way you did. Fascinating.
And once we realized that, we started asking the question, so when did people start using Daniel 12 to talk about an actual doctrine of resurrection? We've said it isn't that.
Physical, bodily resurrection.
And we started looking into all the Qumran literature, and they talk about resurrection. Not much, by the way. It's not a strong doctrine at Qumran. But they talk a lot about Daniel. They know Daniel very well. But they never make the connection. They never use Daniel 12 to talk about resurrection. Neither does the New Testament. Neither does the Hellenistic Second Temple Judaism literature. The earliest reference we could find of anyone using Daniel 12 to feed a doctrine of resurrection, Hippolytus, 4 centuries after Daniel.
Wow. I had no idea.
So it's almost like Daniel gets picked up to be used that way, kind of through circumstantial evidence, because it happens to mention awakening from
it's almost going back to what you said in another podcast that we'll reference here. Is there's an apologetic sense, in a way, right?
Right. We want to defend doctrine, so you try to grab every little piece that might. But
this is a really interesting. I'm going to have to think about this. This is fascinating. Thanks, Dr. Walton, for being with us today to talk about Daniel 12. I want to reference the fact that you have just published a great book called The Lost World of the Prophets, Old Testament Prophecy and Apocalyptic Literature in Ancient Context. We want people to know about that book, and we'll put that in the show notes as well. Your commentary, your first part of your commentary will be out in 2025.
Yes, hopefully November 2025.
All right, excellent. We look forward to that, and we'll come back and talk about that.
Thanks, David.
Occasion.
Love to do it.
Yeah, thanks, John. John Walton is always a great guest on this podcast. He knows the value of the biblical languages, and he knows the how-to of exegesis. I want to say thanks to John Lodsma, who is our Wheaton-based director. Thanks to Ian Rosine, Jesse Dugan, and Rebecca Larson. They help in so many ways behind the scenes produce this podcast. Thanks to PK, Phil Keggy, for our music. Season 5 of Exegetically Speaking is winding down, which means that Season 6 is right around the corner. If you haven't already done so, please give us a 5-star rating and share this podcast with, 40 or 50 of your best friends. Until next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks for listening.